Our first panel today is Big Data as a Turning Point in Sustainable Development. I'd like to welcome to the stage Reem Khouri. Reem is the founder of a technology platform called WISE. WISE is a solution that allows governments, companies, and organizations to measure and track their individual contributions towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Next, I'd like to welcome to the stage Lisa Russell. Lisa is an Emmy award-winning filmmaker who is also a social rights and social justice advocate. She is the founder of an organization called 2030, and she is at the forefront of welcoming creatives into the community of sustainable development leaders in order to magnify the impact of career politicians. But more importantly, she is a community builder, and we welcome Reem and her contributions today. Number 3, I'd like to welcome Mr. Yusuf Abdul-Qadir, who you will see plenty of today as well. Yusuf is a regional director of the New York Civil Liberties Union, which is New York's brand of the ACLU. And Yusuf also was a negotiator of the Sustainable Development Goals during the period between 2013 to 2015 when he served as an advisor within the United Nations. And finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kenneth Strzepek. Dr. Ken is a professor of a lot of things, including policy and economics at the University of Boulder, Colorado. Dr. Strzepek has also been a lecturer at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where we met, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Ken also won the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize as a lead author on the IPCC report on climate change. And that year, the IPCC, along with Ken, shared the Nobel Prize with Al Gore, who also popularized the importance of climate action. To that effect, I will take the stage and join our panelists to begin with the conversation. So, what an interesting composition of people that we've been fortunate to welcome, not just in our conference, but even to open up the conversation today. So, first of all, I'd like to thank you and our distinguished audience as well for coming from near and far to participate in today's conversation. So, a round of applause to everybody. So, Reem, I'd like to begin with a conversation that we can focus on your project. So you and I met in Geneva during the AI for Good Global Summit that was organized by ITU. And ITU is the UN's International Telecommunications Union. And so we learned from this congregation of people that not only is this room focused on the intersection of AI and sustainable development, but people all around the world have a very similar interest in marrying the two important ideas and trends. How are you and your team at WISE making it easier for people to use AI to understand how they're contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals? Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the work that you do and how WISE is a tool that others can use as well.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I don't know if you can hear me.
A little bit closer.
Okay. So I have to actually start by saying that I'm not a technology person, right? So I just want to start with that. I come from the impact world, and WISE was created out of actually a need that we saw in the market. So we have been working in the impact space for a while, and every time we wanted to design a service or a program or a solution to the problems that we saw, we needed data, and we realized that there's no data available. And so that was one of the very first elements that actually made us realize how important it is to come up with a solution that allows people to better understand and analyze their data. The other element that happened was we realized that there's a crisis of trust. And I think this is global. I come from the Middle East, so I'll tell you it's very real where I come from. But I think this is actually a global issue. I think there's a deficit of trust, there's a deficit of efficiency, and there's a deficit of purpose that we're seeing across the globe today. We don't know what is the change that we want to create. Yes, we have the general guidelines of the SDGs, but it sounds nice, but we don't understand how to actually get there. What are the smaller steps? So every time we hear about big data, I want to start by talking about small data, like small steps of how we're going to get there. There's an issue of trust. We keep hearing about millions and millions and trillions of money being spent on, in the case of where I come from in Jordan, I keep hearing about the millions of aid dollars that are going to the Syrian refugees or the Palestinian refugees, and then we're not seeing the impact. So we actually figured out that we need a solution that allows us to track where the money is going and if it's really creating the change that it's supposed to be creating. And then the third issue was the issue of the crisis of purpose, or the deficit of purpose. What we realized when we started our endeavor a year and a half ago was that most organizations, whether they belong to the public sector, private sector, or the not-for-profit world, had trouble articulating their theory of change. What is really the change they want to create? And if you cannot articulate it, you cannot measure it. And by default, so when we saw that all of these are the issues that we're facing, we started an impact analytics software solution. And the very first thing that we did was we started creating, originally we started with a library that included the SDG and the Global Reporting Initiative, etc. And then we realized that's not necessarily helpful because people still don't know what they need to be measuring. And so we started creating a library that's based on industries. If you're a bank, how should you behave towards society and towards your employees and towards your clients? If you're a VC fund, what are the things that you need to be looking at? We also started creating topic specific. If you're a bank that wants to focus on financial inclusion or income mobility, what are the elements that you need to be measuring to ensure that the impact is actually truly happening? And then we also started working on very much trying to explain country, again, also part of the library is country specific, right? Because as beautiful as the 169 targets of the SDGs are, they're not necessarily relevant to the countries, or they're not prioritized as per a country's priority list. Having said that, what we ended up working on as well is helping organizations measure outcomes and impacts versus only outputs. And by saying that, what we mean, so we work with vocational education institutions that graduate thousands and thousands of refugees and underprivileged students. And the first thing they say, we graduate 100,000 students a year, and that's an output, right? The outcome is, have they actually gotten employed? Are they making minimum wage or living wage? Did they get their families out of poverty? And this is the data that we're actually missing and that we don't necessarily, or that exists out there, but we're not analyzing and we're not linking and we're not seeing what variables are affecting it. And this is where we also, so this is how we leveraged AI to start showing our clients what variables affect their impact and how they're interrelated. We do something with our clients where we call the ISIS test, right? So this is what I always do with them. When they give me an indicator that's output related, they said, we graduated 100,000 students. I'm like, great, what if they're all ISIS supporters, right? Have you really affected the change that you're saying you're trying to create? And so before going into all of the elements related to the data gathering, we start with the purpose. Like, what's the change you're trying to create? How are you going to get there? What do you need to measure at the output level, at the outcome level, at the impact level? And then based on that, how can we collect the data? Collecting the data in our part of the world is also, and I don't think it's just in our part of the world, but in many different places as well, is one of the biggest challenges that we have. We have a problem of representation. So how much of the data is actually representative of the actual community that we're trying to look at? How is the data being used? So ethically, The governments are actually using the data for surveillance and to crack down on any movement that's happening. The private sector is using it to just make money, and so they're looking at every person as a data point rather than a human being or a citizen. So how can we actually look at public-private partnerships that really would allow for the data to be used for good? And that's one of the main issues we have. The other issue is access, right? So in the largest refugee camp in Jordan, there's no internet. So yes, we'd love to talk about big data, but there is no internet in Zaatari camp that has 800,000 people living in it. But there is data available. So we actually needed to create offline app solutions, mobile survey solutions, right? And so yes, we need to think about the Internet of Things and big data, but we also need to think about the offline and the mobile data that we can actually be used. The last point I want to make is related to what we think we're actually really looking at in terms of when we're producing impact reports and evaluating. So for example, you get a lot of companies today that are producing what they're calling Global Reporting Initiative audited sustainability reports, and they get audited by the likes of Ernst & Young and others, and they get an A+ on their report. The A+ tells you that you've gathered your data correctly, that you've calculated it correctly, but it doesn't tell you if it's actually the quality of the impact that you've created. It tells you that if you said, I spent $200 million to create 2 jobs, that you've calculated the 200 million correctly and the 2 jobs correctly. It doesn't tell you it's stupid to spend $200 million over 2 jobs, and that you could have spent the $200 million to create 200,000 jobs. And this is where we need the innovation and the artificial intelligence to really help us understand the quality of the impact. Today, everything that we have is not about the quality of the impact. So thank you.
Thank you, Reem. We're going to turn the mic over to Lisa. Lisa, you're an expert in telling stories. Your stories have won awards, they've captivated diverse audiences, and they've built teams of people who have become more conscious not only to their individual impacts, but to their opportunities to create broader impacts that ultimately contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, what has brought you, a filmmaker and an artist and a creative, into the world of AI and machine learning and big data? Today isn't the first time that you've spoken about it, but what compels you to keep this at the top of your agenda? Why is it so important, and why can everybody, regardless of whether they are an expert technologist or a policy leader, why is this accessible to everyone? Why is this relevant to everyone?
Well, thank you for having me. You can hear me okay? All right. Yes. So I have an interesting journey into becoming the sort of filmmaker around the SDGs. I didn't go to film school. I actually got my master's in public health, and I was on a road to working in the humanitarian aid field. So I worked in Kosovo and Albania during the 1999 war and witnessed sort of a lot of unethical storytelling practices that I was like, this is, you know, really disrespectful to women in particular who were refugees in the refugee camps, and it sparked an idea of me wanting to become a filmmaker. So at that time, there weren't a lot of people doing sort of filmmaking and global development. It was a lot of journalism, which is very different. So I really embarked on you know, becoming a storyteller in terms of being able to take this kind of dense information and translate it to a wider audience. And so I continue that work. I not only work as a filmmaker, I curate artists. One of the artists I work with is going to be performing during lunch. I make films. I work with beatboxers, DJs, poets. We met at an event where I was fortunate to bring 2 poets to help talk about climate restoration. But my journey into sort of AI and big data came when I got an email saying that I was nominated to speak do a TEDx talk for Johnson & Johnson. And I was like, yes, this is great. Johnson & Johnson does work in the global health and development space. They support a lot of like global women's health stuff. And they said, and the theme for this year's conference is big data. And I was like, what? Like, why would me? Like, I knew nothing. I'm literally like nothing about big data. But I really wanted to do the talk. So I researched everything about big data and storytelling, big data and creativity, big data and filmmaking, and what kept popping up was Netflix. And so I really learned what the Netflix model was, and I was like, oh, how interesting is this, that they collect all this data to be able to better predict what kind of programs they want to invest in. So House of Cards, for example, was completely built on the outcomes of the data that they were collecting from their users. And they were so convinced that House of Cards was going to be successful, they outbid like HBO, they outbid Showtime, and they were basically like, you know, we're so convinced this is the perfect program for our audience, we're not just going to pilot it, we're going to spend $2 million and produce all 24 episodes or whatever it was, and it was extremely successful, and that sort of started the trend of this like binge watching programming or whatever. And one of the ethical problems I've always struggled with, and again it was why I became a filmmaker in the first place, is how do we tell global health and development stories without victimizing people? You know, I would go to Tanzania and my artist friends are like, we love when you're in Tanzania, but why is it you're always showing the bad parts of Tanzania? And I'm like, okay, fair, but like I work for the UN and I work for NGOs and I tell global health stories. So how can I talk about maternal health in Tanzania and not show women who are suffering from, you know, obstetric fistula? Or how do you talk about, you know, young people affected by war and not talk about their family who is massacred? So I was ethically, I almost quit my career 3 times over this ethical dilemma. And it still exists today. I curate the Women Deliver Film Festival. There was 8,000 people who went to Canada in June. I curate a lot of film festivals in this space. There are horrific videos still being produced. And my argument is the reason why we keep what's called this, there's a term that's really horrendous, but they call it poverty porn. Have you heard of this? So why do we keep producing these types of content? It's because we have no feedback mechanisms. In the types of content I produce, the kind of art and the kind of films that I produce, there is no feedback mechanism. So like regular films that have box office numbers or press reviews or ratings like on Rotten Tomatoes, I can make a film for an NGO, it might go up on YouTube and maybe it'll get a lot of likes and they'll be like, oh, it was successful. But a lot of likes doesn't translate to responsible storytelling. So my theory was, and I developed this concept called story shifter, is that we would use machine learning and data analytics to capture, to create an entertainment platform that housed different content. And with the option of like having action steps, like, oh, I watched this piece, this PSA, and now I want to donate to this, you know, nonprofit, I want to sign this petition, I want to purchase this thing from a socially conscious brand, and being able on the back end to analyze what kind of content appeals to which audiences and what kind of content inspires people to act. I'm still like blown away when I get like, I'm a contracted filmmaker for the UN, so I have to go through the vendor process, which means I have to read like 50-page like RFPs. And they're like, so the audience for this film is going to be policymakers, government officials, millennials, and the general public. And I was like, you can't make a film with audiences that are that broad. So, you know, I was one of the few artists who were involved in the writing of the SDG outcome document. I was at the town hall meetings at the UN, and it was only myself and one other creative professional who was in there advocating to get arts and artists into the outcome document. And because there were only 2 of us in that room, and I counted it, I word counted it, out of the 16,000 words in the SDG outcome document in the Agenda 2030, arts and artists are never mentioned, and creativity is only mentioned twice. Yet if you do the research, the creative economy is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. So I can go on and on about this, but my interest in this space, I'm not a tech person at all either, but I think we undervalue the role of artists and storytellers in helping to propel the SDG agenda, and I'm trying to, through my work, both as a filmmaker, but also just like as a voice, not just an entertainer or a token performer, but like as a voice, to try to push giving artists and filmmakers and DJs and musicians a seat at the table. And I'll just say this because I really honestly believe this. Like, if you can survive in New York City as an independent artist or filmmaker, you have incredible creative thinking and problem-solving skills. So why would you not want us in a room with policymakers talking about climate change? So that's all I'm going to say. But my organization's called Create 2030, and I welcome like any input, support, guidance, or whatnot, because it's really a weird lane to be in this SDG community, but special, just challenging. Yeah. That's
Phenomenal. Thank you so much. We're gonna circle back to Lisa and Reem in just a moment. We're gonna get to know Yusuf a little bit better. Yusuf, you and I have been friends for some time, and we also were in the room when the SDGs were being negotiated between 2013 and 2015. So you've had an interesting journey yourself. Your background is a history, a dedicated interest and a passion for alleviating poverty, growing up in New York City, seeing what the extent of poverty can be here in the most developed city in the world, while at the same time going to Syracuse and developing what is now one of the leading smart cities in the world. In the process, you have contributed to the Sustainable Development Goals. You've worked with the leaders of developing states within the UN and leaders beyond that. You've advised local governments, and you've worked as a consultant in environmentally responsible business. Today, you are a director within the ACLU, and your work in representing the broad rights of the people here in the United States, and particularly in New York, converge on particular areas where AI tools and machine learning tools, such as computer vision, facial recognition, are contributing to our ability to engage with society in a way that touches on that balance between privacy and security. It's quite a journey. And while there are many ways to represent the experiences of people, one way is by giving it to our very own Ibn Battuta, who's traveled through the various lands of social impact and has seen a lot of it. Yusuf, I'd like you to share a little bit about your journey and what you think the various experiences you've had inform you towards when it comes to the importance and the readiness of these communities to absorb artificial intelligence and to contribute the data that's needed to represent them in that area. Thank you, Yusuf.
I definitely paid him to say all of that, so just to be clear. Apparently a lot. But you know, I'm terribly interested in intergenerational equity. And for those who may not be familiar with the term, growing up in a family that was impoverished, there's generations of poverty, generations of discrimination, generations of challenge. And if we're going to be transitioning to this fourth industrial revolution, and if we're going to be transitioning to this fourth industrial revolution where artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things are converging, how are we going to do that when we haven't even gotten people to the second industrial revolution or the third industrial revolution, when the digital literacy is pretty much non-existent for many parts of our society? And I was deeply concerned that we're rapidly changing technology, constantly changing, but the literacy that people have isn't keeping pace. And while I would probably also say I'm not a technologist, actually we all are, because technology impacts every aspect of our lives. If you're a doctor, you need data, you will use technology. If you are a creative, you need data, you will use technology. And technology touches every facet of our lives, except we only speak about it for people who have tech degrees, right? We speak about it from the lens of information technology or information management or information security. We don't think about what are the ethical questions that have to be raised. We don't think about what are the social, societal implications of the technologies that we're designing. And so for me, the convergence of that is very much what I do professionally and what I do in the academy as a professor at Syracuse University, where I teach students on information policy. Actually, Reem, you mentioned something about ethical dilemma. Actually, one of our days of class is on ethical dilemmas. My students will tell you they're here, they're tired of me talking about ethical dilemmas, but there are lots of ethical dilemmas with the types of technologies that we are developing and the ways with which they're used and can be abused to surveil communities, to oppress communities, and to harm communities, as opposed to propelling an agenda that, as you said in the opening, is supposed to leave no person behind. So what are the types of things that we can think about at the intersection of, let's say, privacy and technology? Let's think about things like biometrics or facial recognition technology, right? Folks would say, and particularly there's a conversation that's going on in the US about active shooters, and we need to have school resource officers in schools. This is the low-tech version of what we are calling for. Except what we found is, one, school resource officers, which are police officers in schools, do not actually make schools safer, right? Statistically, just the data tells us that's the case. And two, they're more likely to be used to discipline students of color. Without an intergenerational framework to be able to guide you, to be able to understand the legacies that exist with respect to school discipline, you would not be able to see and advocate as to why there shouldn't be school resource officers in schools. Because statistically, they're more likely to discipline black and brown students. They're statistically more likely to suspend them and put them on what we call the school to prison pipeline. Imagine that with facial recognition technology, right? Which, by the way, is significantly problematic because the data set can't distinguish between my face or his face or his face. We all look the same to the technology. And so they haven't built enough of a data set to be able to distinguish between, am I the person who's actually the one that's guilty of this crime, or the suspect, or is someone else? And what we find when we see surveillance technology used and surveillance footage used is that people are often coerced to cop to plea deals, whether or not they're culpable or not. And so now use that technology in a country that is post-conflict. We just emerged out of a civil war. The very people who were the perpetrators of the genocide are the same very people who are in the government. And now they've got facial recognition technology, right? Let's look at more advanced, and I don't like to use these terminologies because I think they're offensive, but more developed societies, right? Let's think about what's going on and what has been going on in Hong Kong, right? The millions of people who are on the streets protesting and organizing, and they're needing to cover their faces so the facial recognition technology can't track their moments. And it's not just facial recognition technology, because the Internet of Things is everywhere. It's your phones, right? It's what's happening in the US right now with people who are protesting Standing Rock, right? Who are protesting the pipelines that are being built in indigenous lands, right? Violating treaties, violating indigenous rights. The FBI and other government officials are monitoring the Facebook conversations that people are having, are able to get warrantless access to your information, to be able to have conversations, to look at your conversations, to begin to track how are you organizing, how are you advocating, to be able to squash your ability to protest and to push back. And so those technologies in the hands of the most problematic people was very dangerous. And we have a history of this in the United States. There was COINTELPRO. We have learned the lessons of what happened with the government surveillance state being able to have access to information, and they didn't use it wisely. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, tapped the phones of Martin Luther King, right? To be able to threaten him and his family, to be able to coerce them to leave the movement. They were considered terrorists. And so when you think about the ways with which we use technology and the ways with which technology can be abused, there's a significant concern. There's a part of the conversation about, and often in the national security space, we think about, ensuring, and I was at a conversation at the UN yesterday where I was like, great conversation, I'm a little disappointed with the ways in which we're framing the narrative when we talk about countering violent extremism, which is a term that is used in the national security space that some people like and some people may not like. But it's a term that is important to talk about. How do we counter people who are more likely to become, to use violent extremism? Without taking a critical race theory framework as your lens to begin to understand the legacies of what we perceive to be those who are problematic and who we then dub as folks that are not worthy of political dissent, the technology in those actors' hands it's terribly dangerous. On the flip side, what is the impact of cyber criminals, right, who are able to traffic people with using technology, right, who are able to traffic people as has been a trade throughout human history, to engage in that kind of significantly problematic practice of slave labor, of sexual exploitation, and using technology as the medium with which they can communicate. using technology as the medium in which to auction people off. If we're not building people's capacity to understand how technology is going to impact their specific silo, then they will only ever be in silos. Then they only will ever be in the space where they're not having a conversation about the ethics behind algorithms and the problems with which algorithms are used and can be abused. Where they're not in the conversations about what are the racial implications of the technologies and the lack of data sets that we have in the criminal justice world. How are we not thinking about what cyber criminals are able to use with respect to their access to unfettered access to technology to be able to circumvent and hide and be able to communicate to continue and further criminal activity. And I think it's really essential that we begin to elevate in this conversation the need for every sector of our society to have increased literacy. But if you don't take that intergenerational equity approach, then I don't think you're going to be able to do that. So I would push back a little bit for my two panelists before me who are very much tech people. You are absolutely adding significant value. Okay, I can't program things, so I'm not a programmer. But you are uniquely positioned to understand the implications of technology on the spaces with which you exist. And you add value in ways which technologists or information technologists or information security managers aren't going to be able to do because you have that unique lens. And so I hope that I've added something to the conversation. I don't think I can do anything in comparison to those who preceded me, but I think it's terribly important for us to increase the digital literacy across the ecosystems that exist.
Thank you so much, Yusuf. You've definitely added a lot of flavor to the conversation and a lot of food for us to think about when engaging very pressing civil rights issues that are currently consuming our media and that surround us, definitely in New York City and definitely here in the States. Variations of that are also true on the global scale. And to zoom out a little bit, I want to pass the mic to Dr. Ken. Dr. Strzepek, you've also had quite a diversity of experiences. By training, you're an engineer. You also have a PhD in economics, and you're working on your second PhD, which perhaps you can touch on. So you love to learn. What can you help us learn about the Sustainable Development Goals, the story of how data has become increasingly prominent in the decision-making sphere of not only the public, but of policy leaders in particular, and how that has been a prominent role in your career, not only as an engineer, but as someone who trains policy leaders in some of the most respected destinations for that particular kind of academic training. Please, Dr. Strzepek.
Okay. So, since nobody wants to be a technologist, I'll be that today. So I am the nerd. If you could I want to take you through a few iconic slides here as I talk to break this up a little bit. But I'm at the forefront of trying to implement the SDGs and have been involved in that since 1973. And I wanted to go last because I wanted to fit in with my colleagues, and I love the presentation. And I have to, at this point, thank my mother, who, when I was 7, sent me to Saturday school at Rhode Island School of Design to get that side of me. So I'm a nerd, but I'm not. I'm understanding that, and that's why I ended up at the Kennedy School of Government and Policy. So it's all related about policy. And one of the things we want to talk about as we go global, and we're going to talk primarily focusing on 2 key goals here with my colleague Channing Art. And Channing is the division director at the what's called IFPRI, and IFPRI is the International Food Policy Research Institute. And we've been working together for over 20 years trying to develop two of the goals. If we go to the next slide. Okay, so up there, reducing poverty and ending hunger. So IFPRI is about doing that. And so one of the things about data is there is data poverty, and there's data hunger. And they used to talk about the food deserts in the inner cities. Is we have a Western view of AI and data, which is very dangerous, okay? And we talk about it in policy settings. And the other problem is hunger and food are related, and poverty have 2 things. They're global in nature. Okay, they're global in nature because they're related to weather and climate. So it's related to climate change. And as we develop, if we don't develop with a resilient lens for the future, we are going to have problems intergenerationally. We will develop systems for people that will be not proper at that point. So data is important globally, but the other thing is that as we look at trade, trade is an enormously important thing with food. And how you do that, and it's usually not done in an ethical way. So we have to have fair trade and these kind of things on there. But trade is important in meeting that it's okay to grow flowers and sell them to Europe if the workers who did that get money to buy grain from Kansas. That can happen, but it doesn't, for many of the reasons that you were pointing out in the other institutional issues. But policy in development, next slide, we need more data, is because of this. And Ramy said it once before, we are plagued with uncertainty. Development's not about the past. We need to study it and be historians. We're talking about development is for the future in a world we don't know. And the number one thing that we face is risk. We face uncertainty about what will the climate be? What will the politicians do for climate policy? If we get the climate policy, our science of climate is 50% of our uncertainty is the science. We just don't know enough. If we go to a certain level of emissions, what will happen? Okay, so it's all uncertain. What's going to happen in other policies? What's going to happen? We just go on opening the front page today. How does that affect 20 and 30 years down the road? If you build a road in Namibia, do you make it for 100 cubic inches of rainfall, or do you make it for 200? Because if you make it for too small, in the next big storm, it's gone. These are big issues that we have to look at in doing that. So if we go to the next slide, as we look at this, this is one of the problems. This is the data on production of agriculture in Mozambique. We can show that everywhere. There's gaps there. There's data desert. What do we do if we need a global model to deal with these issues? How do we properly represent Mozambique? And we do it assuming that we know what's in those spikes. Those could be down or up in those areas. So next slide. One of the things that we're trying to do is use technology. And when I talk a little later, I'm going to put some quotes around AI, which I think is a little bit misused at times. But how can we use technology to gather data that takes into account everything that Yusuf said? If we fly a drone over Mozambique to gather data, are we gathering just data on food production, or are we looking to find something else there? We have to be careful how that's used. So there's ethical issues. Next slide. And then as we go through, what are we trying to do of monitoring the data? These kinds of things are great for the US. We can put monitors in the soil and things like that. Are we going to do that in Mozambique? Are we going to do that in Botswana? Are we going to do that in India, Nepal? We have to be careful how we're doing that. Next slide. Okay, next slide. The other thing that we have here is data. Yeah. This is one of the biggest problems, and if anybody here in the room is using it, is we are drinking from a fire hose. So now with the satellite data, we can collect global data on climate every hour, or even every minute, but every hour at grid points of every 5 meters. And everybody thinks, oh great, it's filling up terabytes of storage everywhere. We can't use it. So what we do is we aggregate it, and you wasted all your money. So what do? How do we use that to make decisions for people? Because Pete, you said leave nobody behind. Recent work we did in Southern Africa on understanding the development of Southern Africa's water, irrigation, and energy. We left 60% of the people behind. It was immoral because we only modeled the things that had data. The only thing that had data was the market. 60% of the people are subsistence farmers, and the data is not in the data set. What about them? So that's our next project that we're in. How do we bring them into our models to decide whether to irrigate or put in solar energy or make hydropower? How do we use the Zambezi River? Do we use it for energy or do we use it for food? Both are critical to development. Next slide. We go forward. So look, these are the computer models we use for climate change. Everybody's worried about climate change. One of the reasons we have 50% uncertainty, next slide, go through, is that we have these huge issues. So if you look, on the top is you looking at western United States at 2 degrees by 2 degrees. There's no Rocky Mountains. Living in Colorado, the bottom is 25 by 25 kilometers. We see the peaks. That is really different. If you model those two, the answers you get for how climate change will change us. We need computing power to do those kind of things. So we have the data, we have measurements on 5 meter by 5 meter soil. We aggregate them to 500 by 500 meters. Next slide. You see this, everybody says, well, just average the data. That's West Africa precip by the end of the century. If you average all the computer models of the future of climate, it says there's no problem. We have a risk of being at 30% of the current precipitation or 80% in the future. We have to be able to model those, look at those implications to make development decisions that protect the poorest. Because we'll make decisions and people will adapt to them in the rich, but it's the poor, again, that are left behind. Next slide. Quickly, we want to go through it. So this is how uncertain South Africa is. Go ahead. We're going to come to our other side. There's just enormous the amount of data we need to process, so we need better and faster computers. But this is the IFPRI model of the world to look at food policy. We have to model the entire world, and we have data now to use it, but we can only run 1% of what we need to get the proper answers. Next slide. And so what happens is we run these detailed computer models about that. So right now, if you run at 2 degrees, you have 5,000 grids. If you run it at 1/12, where most of the data is, there's 2,500,000 grids. You have to solve that. There are ways to do distributed computing that if we can get 2,500,000 computers, I bet that's right within Manhattan, there's that many. Can we connect those and use them for development? Next slide. The problem is, what we end up doing is we forget people. This is in Nigeria. One of the important ways that you can protect farmers in Nigeria is by mulching. What that person has done is collected tree branches and leaves to put on the soil to keep the evaporation down. So he uses less water. Next slide. Another thing they do is they dig holes and use 1/2 of the land and bring all the water to these holes. So if you go through the next slide, but what we do is we're ready for these Western tools that gather the data on large farms. We are not able to model those two people above because our tools and our data are not for that level. If we want to get the poorest for the poor, we have to work on getting that data. So that's kind of the message, but it's a message from technology, but it's also a measure of institutions and a measure of policy. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what we need to do is we have to have a multidisciplinary approach to this to solve the problems. And as my fellow panelists have said, the tools are there. How do we use them? And it's about caring for the people. And if we cared about the people, we would be able to develop some of these issues. Thank you.
So that actually brings us to the end of our time for this segment. We will allow room for one question as long as it's tailored to the entire audience, to the entire panel. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask at this time? After all that, you guys don't have one question? All right, who has a question? Gentleman in the back.
I completely agree with you that we do need to care for the people, but something else in the process is the wildlife and the animals, and there's an immense amount of good that can be brought to that space in conjunction with the people, specifically in Africa, which is where I'm from.
All right, so the gentleman commented that not only are the people important, but wildlife and animals are also needed in order to be factored into our models and captured in our data. And ultimately, by considering them, it's an aggregate benefit to us human beings as well, and vice versa. Excellent. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask and get a response for? Yes.
So my question is, given all the uncertainties that you talked about, given the data gaps, given the inability to actually measure some of the things that we need to measure, what policies would you see that we could implement to help produce the kind of data that we actually can find more actionable?
Okay, I think the answer is, to quote my friend from South Africa, is horses for courses. We have to not have one solution for everywhere. I think we have to look at things regionally and even continentally. And even if you go to Africa, it's much different in North Africa than Southern Africa, is looking at things from a regional perspective and trying to understand the needs there in gathering the data. And then the assurances. So one of the things that happens in, and my colleague here was in Albania. We worked in Albania on development. We had a $100,000 project as a consultant. The government official demanded $250,000 for the rainfall data for the country. So this idea that data is not possessive, it's public good, and just working on that. And most of it is capital and resource issues, and getting the next generation, that's what we'll talk about a little bit later, getting good minds to come and bring solutions that are cost effective. And a solution that may work in Namibia is going to be different than one that works in Nebraska or one in Iowa or in the Netherlands. So we want to work on that. And to answer the question before, nature is one of the worst collected data in the world and needs the most computing, because nature doesn't live by averages. The Colorado River and other things, they need once every 20 years a big flood to happen to keep its ecosystem. That means you have to run your models continuously, and that's where we get into the computing issues, is we can't look at the uncertainties and the risks that way. So putting nature into our models requires even more computing power and more data, and people are trying to work on that. And it's always just resources, you know, and how do we move forward, and how do we care about the poor? And that's an issue of resource allocation.
Sorry, I'm going to be like 30 seconds also to the kind of wildlife question. Indigenous communities don't see themselves separate. The person from nature, from the wildlife, they see themselves as a part of an ecosystem, and they realize that their harm or their harm to their natural environment is a harm and is a risk to their own lives. And so I think, you know, we should be both cognizant that traditional communities realize the necessity to keep that harmony, and because they still live within those ecosystems, they're cognizant of the harm that we're doing and how that harm is going to continue to wreak havoc on us as a species and our ability to still be on this planet as well. And oftentimes people say, you know, the planet is going to be here. Like it's just going to be really hot, and we won't be able to survive on it, right? Like that's the issue, and I think sometimes we talk about it as if like the planet's going to blow up, which, you know, probably is not likely to happen. But our ability to be able to thrive on this planet is at risk. And in fact, to my colleague's point, some people's ability to be able to thrive is still going to be consistent, and others are going to be harmed and at significant risk. But thank you for bringing up that issue about nature.
Can I address your policy question just from the point of view of how we practically actually do it? So we work very much with foundations and private sector organizations that need to collect the data that's missing. We look at what kind of reinforcing mechanisms can we put in place. So we cannot affect policy. But what we do is we realize there are a rise of number of organizations that provide access to grants and funding based on the evidence and the proof of impact, if you want, that these organizations would produce. And so we're even looking at how our system is going to allow for performance-based payments on the blockchain in order to actually create this incentive mechanism. On the other hand, we have some of the policies, what we're seeing is that if you're actually not reporting on ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues, you can actually get delisted from certain stock exchanges. Funnily enough, this is the truth in Dubai and London. It's not the case here in the US. Someone was asking me for working in the US, and we said it's actually the country that has the least legislation on sustainability and ESG-based performance. So actually, we're focusing much more on other parts of the world. But this is how we're also looking at it. How can we not just demonstrate through evidence that sustainability is actually contributing to exponential impact or better and more competitive bottom line if you're the private sector, but creating some kind of incentive mechanism to get access to funding or investment. So now we're also seeing a rise of ESG-based private equity funds and VC funds, which I think is also going to be quite interesting to look at. And providing the data to build that evidence would be very important.
Excellent. Let's give a round of applause once again to our first panel. So our panelists are going to be here for another part of the day, and some of them you will see again. So those who have a question that might be more directed to one panelist at a time, we invite you to speak to them during the break, as long as they're not too busy with their coffee needs as well. To that effect, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and right now it's 10:58, 11:08, we will reconvene. Thank you.